science in their supply chain management and logistics degree course. And so my sincere congratulations and best wishes on these initiatives. And thank you very much for all your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krish. Mr. Umitaliv would like to add few opening remarks as well. Господин Уmitaliv, да, Калбек Сапарбекович, можно, пожалуйста, тоже, да, сказать несколько слов со стороны КТУ?
Здравствуйте всем. В первую очередь, здравствуйте, господин Кришна Кумар, наш не только надежный партнер, но и наш надежный друг и наш наставник. Я вас еще раз приветствую на нашем сегодняшнем семинаре как одного из инициаторов сегодняшнего семинара. Также всем здравствуйте нашим коллегам, нашим преподавателям, нашим студентам, коллегам из Офиса Всемирного банка, возглавляемой с Ириной, и Департамента госзакупок, и Учебного центра Министерства финансов. Я в первую очередь от имени нашего университета, от имени нашей кафедры и от имени недавно вновь созданной обсерватории еще раз всех приветствую и благодарю. Выражаю огромную благодарность за ваше участие в сегодняшнем очень таком важном, хорошем, интересном семинаре. Кратко я хотел подчеркнуть, что Кыргызский государственный технический университет имени Разахова и группа Всемирного банка успешно и плодотворно продолжает сотрудничество для усиления системы государственных закупок в Кыргызской Республике. Как мы все знаем, институциональное усиление или повышение квалификации кадров системы государственных закупок остается актуальной, исключительно важной задачей для всех участников процесса государственных закупок. И в связи с этим наш университет впервые в Кыргызстане начал подготовку бакалавров и магистрантов. И в настоящее время мы хотим отметить, что у нас численность достигла уже 260 студентов вместе с бакалаврами и магистрантами. И очень хорошая новость, я уже в самом начале еще сказал, в этом году постановлением правительства утвержден впервые в Кыргызстане 3-й уровень болонской системы образования, докторантура PhD. И наш университет КГТУ имени Исхака Разахова выбран как пилотный университет, где будет реализовываться докторантура, докторская школа по PhD. В этом нашему университету помогает германское техническое сотрудничество GIZ. И в сентябре этого года мы намереваемся открыть докторскую школу и набрать первых докторантов по 5 специальностям: машиностроение, энергетика и в том числе логистика государственных закупок. Пока планируем сделать в этом году набор 2 или 3 докторантов. Сейчас программа разрабатывается, учебная программа, 4-летняя она будет. Ищем, где они будут стажироваться, где они будут, какое исследование будут делать. Одним словом, полноценная докторская программа в соответствии с болонской системой у нас в университете будет запущена. Очень такой хорошей новостью я хотел поделиться, особенно с нашими партнерами из Всемирного банка, из отделов, из Департамента госзакупок и Учебного центра Министерства финансов, что это хороший будет вклад наш для усиления системы государственных закупок в Кыргызской Республике. Еще я хотел подчеркнуть, что правильно сказал наш друг и наставник Криш, что недавно мы открыли очень такую важную структуру, обсерваторию в сфере государственных закупок. И, конечно, в этом большую нам поддержку, помощь оказали команда Всемирного банка из Бишкека, возглавляемая Ириной, Департамент госзакупок, госпожой Нуриной Байзаковой, и учебный центр Серке Турдумамбетовой. Хороший вклад сделали, чтобы для полноценной, хорошей для хорошего функционирования этой обсерватории. Я должен отметить, что прошло уже 7-й месяц, работает наша обсерватория. Я хочу подчеркнуть, что наша обсерватория плодотворно, гармонично и синхронно интегрировался в процесс обучения, процесс исследования и процессы распространения хорошей практики для усиления институционального усиления персонала государственных закупок в Кыргызской республике. Мы надеемся, что в регионе нас узнали, услышали, потому что последняя статистика обзора нашего сайта, веб-сайта ppilo.kg доказывает, что география охвата очень уже широкая, интерес очень большой. И мы надеемся, что наша обсерватория наравне с нашей кафедрой, которая будет и докторантуру, и магистратов, и бакалавра готовит, и вместе с нашим университетом, который нас постоянно поддерживает, мы сделаем хороший вклад именно для усиления и повышения потенциала специалистов, которые работают в сфере государственных закупок. И сегодняшнее мероприятие очень здорово, что это первый шаг в рамках плана действий, который мы совместно разработали с Офисом Всемирного банка Бишкека на 3-летний период. Это одно из начала нашей деятельности в рамках именно вот этого 3-летнего нашей программы. И очень здорово, что этот сегодняшний семинар, это вот дисциплина, и она, я думаю, всем понравится, и Всемирный банк дальше хочет продолжать именно такую дисциплину, разработать полностью пакет программы. Хотят они профинансировать экспертов, которые разработают программу для студентов, для преподавателей. И в дальнейшем нашей кафедре, нашему университету остается только включить нашу учебную программу, и все бакалавры, магистранты, докторанты, они будут обучать эту дисциплину Science of Behavior, которая очень актуальна, современна и востребована в мире, особенно в сфере государственных закупок. Всем нам удачи, интересных открытий, интересных мнений, дискуссий сегодня. Спасибо вам.
Спасибо большое, Акылбек Сапарбекович. Очень с удовольствием я послушала о ваших достижениях. Нам очень радостно видеть, что вы развиваетесь, не стоите на месте. Это очень приятно. И сейчас я бы хотела дать возможность Нуриде Асановне, директору Департамента государственных закупок, тоже нашему постоянному партнеру, большому профессионалу, замечательной женщине, тоже сказать несколько приветственных слов. Пожалуйста, Нурида Асановна. Микрофончик включите, Нурида Асановна, микрофончик.
Спасибо большое, Ирина Владимировна, за добрые слова. Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. В первую очередь хотелось бы, конечно, поблагодарить организаторов мероприятия, группу Всемирного банка, за организацию такого семинара. Также хотелось поблагодарить лектора Кришна Кумара, господина, и всех участников данного мероприятия. И, как вы знаете, наверное, основными функциями Департамента государственных закупок является координирование и регулирование деятельности закупающих организаций, совершенствование и развитие методологии государственных закупок. И в этой связи хотелось бы отметить, что на сегодняшний день у нас зарегистрировано более 4000 закупающих организаций на портале госзакупок и более 28 тысяч поставщиков. Но несомненно, что в своей работе департамент госзакупок и вообще госзакупщики, они работают с людьми, наверное, да, в первую очередь. И тесно, наверное, госзакупки перекликаются с социальными науками, в числе которых, наверное, и вот это вот социально-поведенческие науки. Для меня это направление абсолютно новое, я честно признаюсь. И благодаря, наверное, Всемирному банку мы изучим и посмотрим, как это все можно будет интегрировать в систему государственных закупок, потому что, работая с таким большим количеством пользователей веб-портала государственных закупок, с таким большим количеством закупающих организаций, несомненно, это поведение. Ну, как бы поведенческие науки мы уже даже не осознавая того, мы его все равно, мы эти науки, наверное, применяем при разработке методологии, потому что при разработке методологии все время задаешься вопросом, а как они поймут, а как они поведут себя, может быть, вот здесь надо как-то четко расписать, здесь надо будет что-то больше и четче прописать. Ну и в этой связи мне самой очень интересно это направление, потому что оно действительно новое на данном мероприятии по данной теме. Впервые, и поэтому давайте послушаем. Хочется пожелать всем успешного, плодотворного дня и успешной работы. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо большое, Нурида Асановна. Благодарю, что приняли участие в нашем мероприятии. Я бы хотела тоже попросить Эрке, руководителя учебного центра при Министерстве финансов, тоже одного из наших основных партнеров по развитию, сказать несколько приветственных слов. Пожалуйста, Эрке.
Большое спасибо, Ирина. Уважаемые участники, здравствуйте. Рада приветствовать вас всех. От лица коллектива всего учебного центра рада приветствовать сотрудников ПГТУ имени Исхака Разакова и, конечно же, коллег из Всемирного банка. Очень заинтересовала сегодняшняя тема и то, что госпожа Джона Изабель Соуза подготовит сегодняшнюю презентацию по поведенческой науке. Это очень интересно. Я посмотрела исследование Всемирного банка. Оказывается, Всемирный банк начал заниматься этой темой еще с 2010 года. И, конечно же, там были различные исследования, которые были реализованы и в Нидерландах, и в Великобритании. И если эти исследования будут проведены у нас в Кыргызстане, мы будем только рады. Со своей стороны хочу сказать, что мы подвели итоги за 2020 год. И, в принципе, учебный центр, даже несмотря на пандемию, обучил более 4000 человек за 2020 год. Это были и онлайн обучение, и какие-то формы были офлайн. Поэтому пандемия не помешала нашему учебному центру быстро адаптироваться и обучать наших слушателей. Конечно же, хочу сказать, что я сегодня привела двух своих коллег. Вот мне было интересно слышать, как Акылбек Агай говорил, что здесь открывается и докторантура. Надеюсь, что мои будущие, коллеги мои в будущем поступят к вам. И мы будем рады сотрудничеству с КГТУ. А со своей стороны хочу сказать, что мы уже подготовили, я сегодня привезла меморандум о сотрудничестве. И студенты КГТУ, получившие диплом в 2020 году и в 2021 году, могут прийти к нам и сдать тестирование, оплатив только за само тестирование всего лишь 250 сом. И получить сертификат первого уровня специалиста по закупкам. Поэтому мы открыты и готовы всегда к сотрудничеству. Спасибо за внимание.
Эрке, спасибо большое. Я думаю, что это прямо такой очень важный шаг, потому что вопрос сертификации выпускников, он стоял достаточно всегда остро. И то, что сейчас вы уже на этапе подписания меморандума с техническим университетом и предоставляете такую возможность студентам, те, которые выбирают, именно работать в направлении закупок. Я думаю, это очень важный шаг. Спасибо вам большое. А сейчас я бы хотела еще сказать, что на сегодняшнем мероприятии присутствует руководитель группы по закупкам в Центральной Азии Камрул Хасан. Он непосредственно будет работать с нашей командой. И я бы хотела теперь передать слово моей коллеге Джоанне, она специалист по именно социальным вопросам, которая именно представит эту инновационную программу. Krish, can we move to the presentation, or you would like to say some few remarks on what was said so far? Krish, can we proceed with the presentation?
Oh, of course, yes. Thank you very much, everyone. So let's go straight to the presentations. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Joanna, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm projecting my screen. I'll just ask you to confirm that you can see the presentation.
Yes, yes, we can see the presentation. Yes.
That's great. So first of all, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for hosting me. So my name is Joana Lourenço. As Chris was mentioning, I'm part of Embed, the Mind, Behavior and Development Unit, or the Behavioral Science Unit at the World Bank. So it's always a pleasure to present to students. I understand there's people from different levels connected. So thank you very much. Thank you also to the colleagues in the government joining the Public Procurement Department, as well as the Training Center. So today we are here to introduce you a little bit to the topic of behavioral science, particularly as it can apply to public procurement. So what is our agenda today? We'll cover in brief what is behavioral science, why behaviors matter in public procurement, applying a behavioral approach, and we'll look at a number of examples to really try and make it practical. And then we'll look at a few case studies of interventions that we have run to improve a number of results, from performance improvements to tax compliance, meaning revenue mobilization. So I'd like to start with a brief exercise, and I do understand we have simultaneous translation, so let's see how this goes. So for the students that are not in an auditorium, or the colleagues as well, that are able to type in the chat, I would ask you to try and guess which number will come next in the sequence that you can see on the screen. We have 2, 4, 8, and I would ask you to try and guess what number could follow. You can also try to, for the more adventurous ones, you can also try to guess the rule, but then I'll ask Irina or Kwamrul help with the translation from Russian to English. So go ahead, please type your answers in the chat. And yeah, I can see it here. In fact, the chat doesn't appear in my screen when I'm presenting. So if someone could verbalize the answer.
Yes,
Yeah,
Joanna, yes. There is a 16, the most popular answer. There is also 4, 12, 10, 32, but the most popular is 16.
That's great. So I can tell you that all those answers are correct. And I would like if someone can try and guess the rules. So one, I'm gonna just extract what I could get from the answers. So people are 16 is the double. So I think that's probably the rule that was flying people's head. There was also 4, so maybe an alternation between like doubling going backwards or subtracting the last number, for example. Anyone who is keen on trying to guess the rule. There's many other answers that haven't been said and that would be correct after 8.
One opinion is a geometrical progression. That is a suggestion for the rule.
Thank you. So I can say that the rule is way simpler than that.
Maybe 10.
10 is also correct. Why?
I don't know. Really, I don't know, because I think mathematics.
It's fine. So I can advance with
2 and plus 2. No. Maybe 16. 16, I think.
Okay, that's great. So 16 is correct. So I'll
16. I'm sorry. Sorry. 16.
Thank you so much. So just to tell you, all the answers that were said before were correct, but in all the answers that were given, no one mentioned an odd number. So I can tell you that 9 is correct as well. So in fact, the rule is as simple as any number that is higher than the previous number that precedes it. Now, typically what we see here is that people see the sequence of numbers 2, 4, 8, and they immediately assume that the rule must be that it is double. And people tend to persist in answers like 16, as was given here. Sometimes people diverge from these answers, but they end up following the trend that you see on the screen, so giving only even numbers. So even when we couldn't fully do the exercise here because of translation, but even when people are told that the 16 is not correct, or the double rule is not correct, they tend to persist in giving even numbers, and that we saw here. So what is this? This is an example of a bias that we call confirmation bias, which is once you have an idea in mind as to how the reality works, you tend to try and find information that will confirm your worldviews. That is very common in a lot of sectors, and it has been shown even with different types of experts, including experts at the World Bank. So what we are going to see today is a few examples of these and other biases and how they can apply to procurement, and then what we can do to work around those. Okay, so what is behavioral science? Some of you may be familiar with an early book called Nudge that was published by Taylor and Cass Sunstein back in 2008. This really helped popularize behavioral science to the large public. And in the meantime, Taylor has in fact won the Nobel Prize in 2017 for some of his work on behavioral economics. Another classic book is Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, also another Nobel Prize. In the case of Kahneman, earlier than Taylor. So in case some of you have not come across these books, they are an excellent reading and a first start for those interested to learn a little bit more about the topic more broadly. Now, we have gone a long way since the publication of these two books. In fact, a collection back in 2018 indicated that there were over 100 units pressed across the globe applying behavioral insights to the most diversified policy issues. Now, an interesting thing is that behavioral science isn't really developed when it comes to its applications to procurement. So we are extremely excited to hear about the interest of the Kyrgyz Republic in the topic, because as Chris mentioned, we do think there is a lot of potential for behavioral applications in this area. We'll be discussing some, and that they really can help in overcoming things that investments or technology still have not achieved. Okay, so what makes decision-making difficult? A lot of things we are faced with make our decisions difficult. That includes features of the decision itself. So sometimes we have incomplete information, complex information, goals are not clear. The dynamic environment that we're faced with in terms of different people's goals, the relationships, which are extremely important, as we'll see in a second. So the social element of where we make decisions is a really important aspect. Pragmatism, so what is feasible in a given context or not, will also influence what we eventually choose. Process issues, so how easy it is to implement an action and the group influence. And then resource constraints and politics that I'm sure everyone is really aware. So the time and the money constraints we may have, and things around the political economy. So how do we make decisions? So standards policy typically talks about information laws or incentives. So those are the typical tools used by policymakers that you may be the most familiar with. What does a behavioral approach do? The behavioral approach focuses on the mindsets, the decision frames, and the social environments. So it places that we think automatically, which means that we think with mental shortcuts or heuristics, and we'll see examples in just a second. We think socially. So what other people, especially those that we consider our reference group or people we compare ourselves to, is important. And we think with mental models, meaning that our experience and our context shapes our world view. So not accounting for this right column will have a huge implication on our decisions and the impact of what we do. And we'll see examples of that today. Okay, so we are influenced by a number of biases, as I was mentioning before. So we don't always act rational, and biases can come in and distort, sometimes help and sometimes distort our decisions. So we will, I will give you a few examples of some biases and how they apply in the field of procurement. This is by no means a large, like a collection that covers all that apply, but more for the purposes of illustration. So one of them is when bid evaluators are charged with comparing the qualitative parts of competing bids and are aware of their price, a systematic bias occurs, which is giving an unjust advantage to the lower bid. And we term this the lower bid bias. So when you knowing the price, that will anchor you and influence your evaluation also of non-price related factors. Now this can be counteracted by two-stage bids, which are already in process in a lot of places. But when they are not, it is important to know that these sort of biases can influence our decision making. In this case, giving an unfair advantage to the lower bid. Another example is the planning fallacy, or our tendency to underestimate the resources, so the time, cost, and personnel that are needed to complete a future task or project. I mean, I recall my times as a student. I think all students can empathize with this sort of bias. This tends to apply a lot in organizations as well. And it can lead to miscalculating at the planning phase, leading to project overruns or overspends. Now, a close related bias to the planning fallacy is the optimism bias, or a belief that this current project is somewhat different, so will not be affected by the risks that affected previous projects. And that can again lead to planning that is not really aligned with the circumstances, with the result of delays. This can apply, for example, in infrastructure planning and execution, most of which needs to be procured, and can then lead to higher costs and delays. Another example is confirmation bias. So we saw the little exercise at the beginning. Just to remind everyone, is our tendency to search for or interpret information that is in line with our beliefs. And in the case of procurement, an example of how this bias can come into place is when we have strong views as to which company should be awarded the bid, And because we have these preconceived beliefs, for example, because we have worked with this company before and we believe they can do a good job, then that can really influence how we evaluate and interpret the evidence. So that's where solutions such as blinding as to who is applying for contracts could come in place. So just to cover a few other examples. So I mentioned in the beginning that the behavior of others is extremely important in the way we make decisions. That has been shown over and over again in a number of fields. So the belief of what other individuals do or approve and disapprove can affect our behavior. So for example, if my peers are okay with bending the rules, or if everyone else does it, that will reinforce unethical behaviors, for example. So there's a lot of evidence showing that collective behaviors such as corruption are sustained by what we call social norms, which are rooted in these shared attitudes and beliefs. So understanding what these norms are in a given context, it's really important to then be able to design interventions that are able to target them and to overcome them. Another example is reciprocity. This comes across a lot when an example is the collusion of applicants for bids. How does it come across? So reciprocity is our tendency to respond to another's action with one that is equivalent. So for example, reciprocity towards a competing firm, whereby bidders collude to coordinate their bids in exchange for the same type of treatment in the next application. And finally, just to mention a final example, sunk cost fallacy, or our tendency to make decisions based on project costs. So meaning time, effort, and money. So the more costs that have already been incurred, the more that tends to impact our decisions in terms of what we want to do next with the project. Regardless of its success, these upfront investment of resources will really exert an influence on our decisions. So I just gave you a brief snapshot of some biases, trying to draw the link of how they apply to public procurement. So hopefully right now I have convinced you that this is really a warranted topic. So why now, zooming in even more from the biases to why behaviors matter in public procurement, and looking at a few direct examples on how they can and they do apply. So one, so a behavioral lenses can be applied to a number of problems. For example, the lack of incentives for staff. This could be, for example, incentives to apply due diligence in the evaluation of bids. And the number of behavioral barriers can contribute to this behavior. And we'll see an example in just a second. Another example of behaviors is fraud and corruption. So understanding the mechanisms that individuals decide to use to decide to engage or not in corruption, which could be done from a behavioral angle, is again an example. Understanding the social influences, the pressure that may lead an individual to have an unethical behavior. Another example is the reluctance to apply discretion in decisions. That can have a number of behavioral roots, such as the lack of agency, risk aversion, because the individual may fear punishment, or the perceived norms. If no one else is doing it, then the tendency to do it will also be smaller. Another instance of why behaviors ban in public procurement, the resistance to adopt public procurement innovation practices, such as e-procurement, is another example. So Biases that can be at the root of these is what we call status quo, or our tendency to stay the way things are. And this is likely to affect public purchases by challenging the routines or habitual practices, and may create negative attitudes toward changes such as introducing a new procurement system. And then just a final example, time and bandwidth constraints that individuals typically face in organizations, procurement ones not being an exception. And if we have limited bandwidth or limited attention and cognitive resources to deal with tasks, that will affect the way we perform. So for example, we may be more prone to mental shortcuts, as I was demonstrating before. So thinking of what sort of frictions and hassles there is to action in an organization, that can be, for example, in the way systems like e-procurement are designed, is another example of an entry point for behavioral work. So I mentioned a few examples, and just to say that when we're focusing on a problem, it is important to consider three dependent contexts in which we all operate. So the individual context, the group or social context, so what other individuals do in our context, as I was mentioning before, is really important. And then the institutional context. So let's consider the example of fraud and corruption. In addition to social pressures, there will be individual elements such as our motives and rationalization of corruption, how we may justify it, but also institutional aspects. For instance, the clarity or the ease with which the rules can be circumvented, the accountability processes in the organization, and so forth. So once again, it's really important when approaching an issue to take into consideration these three interconnected contexts. Okay, so why behavioral science? Just to cover it in brief, interventions can benefit from a lot of solutions from behavioral science. Those include simplifying procedures, improving what we call the choice architecture, or the way the information and decisions are presented to an individual, adjusting the information provided both in terms of quantity and how the information is presented. We can also work with framing. A lot of work in this area, especially at the level of communication, with a lot of positive results, and we'll see examples at the end. Sending reminders, especially when there's a failure in action because it may slip people's mind, or we can also use reminders to leverage a number of behavioral insights in messages. Using social networks or social norms, sometimes correcting what the perception is towards what is a common behavior. Providing and exposing new ideas in terms of what mental models and behaviors is, and invoking positive identities. So an individual may have a very positive identity that we can leverage towards making a behavior more common. We'll see examples of some of these. There's many others, but this gives you a sense of how we can use behavioral tools to then approach some of the problems that I mentioned before. So adding that, how do we apply the behavioral approach? So in the screen, you can see a figure that illustrates the process that we follow, which indeed is followed by several other organizations in these are slightly similar ways. So this is a process that begins with the definition of the problem. That's a really important stage. We need to understand who is doing the behavior, in which context, what behavior are we talking specifically about. And we usually do this in partnership with the organizations that we're working with. Then we proceed to diagnose the problem and what are the barriers that are preventing individuals from performing this behavior. We do this through diagnostic, typically using quantitative data analysis as well as qualitative analysis. Then we proceed to design what we call a behavioral intervention, which is just another way to say behavioral solutions that address the problem. And then we move to implement them and evaluate them, often by what we call randomized evaluations, so the strongest in terms of providing us evidence. And then we adapt solutions and scale when applicable. Okay, so I mentioned before that a crucial stage in what we do is the behavioral problem definition and diagnostic. So what does diagnostic allows us to do? It allows us to identify and map bottlenecks that can lead to suboptimal outcomes. Typically, we do so by relying on in-depth qualitative research, such as focus groups, interviews, and so forth. And it allows us the creation of journey maps. So for instance, if we think of the taxpayer's journey, so the steps that the taxpayer goes through to pay taxes, we can think of several stages in the individual's decision-making process. So understanding the tax process, deciding to pay taxes, declaring tax, and finally paying. So at each of these stages, there can be barriers to behavior, as you can see illustrated in the screen. So for example, barriers that can affect the decision to pay taxes include the perceived consequences. So will I get punished if I don't pay? The perceived social norms again. So do others pay taxes? And so forth. So through the behavioral diagnostic, we do this journey mapping that allows us to really identify these barriers so that then we have precise information on what we should be targeting in terms of solutions to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve. So as an illustration, now looking at the problem that more directly relates to procurement. So let's consider the problem of applying due diligence and following the standards by procurement staff in evaluating processes of bids. This is just for an illustration. We haven't, in fact, carried out the behavioral diagnostic to look into this issue, but based on discussions we had with colleagues and desk research, and for the purposes of today's talk. So a journey map could look like this. So we start by obtaining bids for evaluation. Then there needs to be a decision as to prioritizing or allocating time for evaluating bids, checking compliance, and so forth. So what we do is we break this desired behavior of finalizing the evaluation on time and to the required standards and quality to the different actions and decisions that the individual must take to get there. And then as the second step, and again, we do this through behavioral diagnostics. So we go directly into the context, we collect data from the target group or the people that need to perform this behavior so that we can map what are the barriers for action at each of these stages. So if you look at the screen, some examples. So when we think of the decision to prioritize or allocate time for the evaluation of bids, barriers could be procrastination, so postponing the action, planning fallacy that we saw before, so thinking that being very optimistic in your planning and thinking that you need less resources than what you effectively need, for example, in terms of time, lack of intrinsic motivation, and so forth. Looking at another example, so exerting effort for quality evaluation of bids, what sort of barriers could apply here? The descriptive norm, if we perceive that no one else applies effort, that will affect our decision to apply effort or not. Lack of feedback, so if our behavior is not rewarded, for example, with positive recognition and appreciation, that can lead to it being less likely to take place. Or even if there's lack of feedback, then we are not able to correct errors that we may be doing in the process. Status quo bias, so if we never did it, we are more prone to not doing it again, time scarcity, and so forth. So as I mentioned, this is an illustration. We haven't done behavioral diagnostic in this problem per se, but just to give you a very concrete notion of how this works. So we start by breaking down this ultimate behavior that we want to promote into this set of decisions and actions. And then we map the bottlenecks through this behavioral diagnostic and data collection on the spot with the individuals that are meant to perform the behavior, so that we can really gather evidence on what the problems are, and then design solutions that are targeted to overcome them. Okay, so we'll now move into a few examples of work that we have been doing at the bank. Some are directly related to procurement, other not necessarily, but that focuses on behaviors that, as we saw before, are effectively important for public procurement as well. So an example is work that was done with firms participating in public procurement in Brazil. So here, what was the issue faced was that the participation in procurement was relatively low, and this impacted the state, so that was the Amazonas state in Brazil, ability to get goods at a reasonable price. So what did the bank do? So we examine who chooses to sell to the government and how to increase participation by taking a two-way approach. So one was a survey with firms to identify these bottlenecks for action. So why are they not selling? And another one was the analysis of administrative data on procurement actions to really try and see what was the pattern in terms of the number of firms that were applying, the prices that they were submitted, and so forth. So what did we learn from this? So we learned that pricey procurement was attributed to different factors. So one had to do with processes, meaning there was slow processes and high transaction costs for the firms applying. That was discouraging them from doing so. So despite having rules and procedures in place, the procurement was taking longer in certain sectors than others. And there were a lot of process burdens that were discouraging, for example, procurement when it came to small purchases. Further, there was also wasted efforts on failed bidding processes. So what the study showed was that an increase in the number of firms that were participating in a given procurement reduced both the probability of failure and the final price for the good. So in this case, 6 or more bidders were needed to really make a difference in terms of prices. And then there was overall frustration of government officials and suppliers, which ultimately led to poor quality in the bids submitted and in the results. Now turning to another example, this time focusing on how we can improve process efficiency. This case comes from an organization called Ideas 42. In this case, they were focusing specifically on why governments often do not respond effectively to citizens' complaints, even when there is political will to do so, and there are efforts to really improve engagement with platforms. So if we think of procurement platforms, for example, we can see how similar aspects could be tackled in terms of thinking how to improve process efficiency to facilitate action. So back to one of the things that I mentioned before, a really important aspect for behavioral science, and a thing that I would like you to take away from today's talk, is that we emphasize the importance of context. So in the case of these citizen complaints, from the office routines of the people that were analyzing these complaints to the software they use, it is important to understand this so that we can understand how to apply solutions that can improve process efficiency. In this case, getting more requests resolved and getting them resolved with better quality. So what did they find here? So first, again, they started by mapping the different decisions and actions. So in this case, verifying the complete and accurate information, forwarding requests to the correct department, and so forth. And at each of these stages, they identified potential bottlenecks or barriers. So examples of these is there was hassle in terms of finding the right information. To illustrate, there were small obstacles for action, which can have really a big impact on behavior. So for example, the forwarding button in the platform was very hard to find. The list of departments was really extensive. That was not user-friendly, and it was resulting in a number of errors. So that sort of insights then allows us to think in ways that we can design, for example, the platform to improve this process efficiency and allow the collection of more complete and accurate data. So focusing on another example, and I'll actually talk about two studies that we did that embed when it comes to performance aspects. So one of them was recent work that we did in terms of thinking how to improve performance management in the Romanian civil servant. Now, what was the issue here? We wanted to understand what sort of biases and barriers are actually at play when it comes to performance management systems that affect civil servants' performance. Examples such as the objective setting, performance ratings, conversations that are happening between managers and staff. So obviously we are talking here about an example in the Romanian civil servants, but I think you can see how this applies to other countries and specifically to given departments such as a procurement one. So what did we do? We gathered qualitative data through focus groups and interviews with staff in different organizations, both desk level staff and managers. And there was also a survey to a number of individuals. What did we find? So performance management systems were not working as expected. There were a number of issues that were resulting in barriers. So an example is the objective setting was not customized. So default objectives were being used, relying on status quo. And conversations between staff and management were not happening frequently. So that led to feedback not being given or being pointless during appraisal. Also, there was an issue that most people were getting a perfect score. And partly this was due to loss aversion from managers. So in the Romanian context, it's there's an issue that this can be challenged in court. So in order to avoid that risk, there was a tendency to give these higher ratings. And it was also the more like the social norms, so the behavior that was commonly performed. What was the main drawback is that the appraisal process was then seen as a tick the box exercise, And this was particularly damaging in terms of the top performing civil servants, because it demotivated them to perform better, as they saw like no distinction between them and people that were performing worse. And we also identified positive deviants that are really, really important and interesting when we to then help us think through solutions. What can be done? We didn't test solutions here. It would be a next stage. But for example, we learned that really where action was needed was at the level of managers, and helping them to have behaviors and actions that could really reinforce the individual's behavior. Thinking, for example, of non-monetary incentives to increase performance, having cheat sheets on what are good managing practices, how to express social recognition, appreciation, providing feedback, reminding managers to do so, because one of the issues was precisely that the feedback chats were not happening, and so forth. So hopefully you can see the parallel of how this could apply, in fact, in any department in a public organization. Okay, so we have gone through a few examples. So we saw the example of the Amazon state in Brazil when it comes to the application for bids from firms, how we approach it. We saw this example of the Romanian public servants and how to improve performance management systems. And then we saw also this mock illustration of how to increase or how to improve behavior of public procurement officers when it comes to the evaluation of bids. What we'll do next is we'll look at a few examples of behavioral interventions that we have done. So on this other side of the screen, looking at evaluations that we put in place on some behavioral solutions to target some of the issues. So the first example that I would like to mention to you is an example of work that we did in Nigeria to motivate public officials. So what was the problem here? So record keeping is really important in this setting because it allows the expenditure tracking of inflows and outflows. So in this case, we are talking about public health clinics that are really resource constrained. So it is important to understand how resources are being used so that we can reduce leakage. But a big constraint that was identified here is that this resource tracking was seen as mundane by workers who effectively lacked the motivation to complete their tasks. So there was no incentive to perform better. In fact, you can even think of opposites or reverse incentives, such as to underreport to get more funding. Also, there was very rare supervision, and that meant that there was really little enforcement of positive rules. So what did we do? We put together a 4 weeks intervention where we tested the impact of social recognition to improve record keeping. So here there were two main components to this behavioral solution that we designed. So one was a certificate of excellence that prominently displayed on a weekly basis at the clinic with stars, how well they were performing. The other action was that there was a public ceremony at the end, so at the end of the 4 weeks, for the best performing facility and all the staff members that had participated in the record keeping. And this was done with a high level member for the government, so there was a lot of visibility, which contributed to this social recognition that we wanted to promote. What did we find? So we found that this really low cost 4 week social recognition intervention improved record keeping in the health facilities. So just an example of how a small tweak at low cost, in this case, providing social recognition, both public to the individuals coming to the clinic, and then public in terms of direct reward in an open ceremony to staff, had a really positive impact in terms of improving this record keeping. The final example that I'll be mentioning today comes from experiments in behavioral interventions that we have been running to increase tax compliance. So you can see an example of 5 countries in the screen, so Latvia, Kosovo, so forth, where we have run this type of work. In fact, we have run it in other countries as well, like Indonesia, with really positive results in terms of improving tax collection. And the reason I wanted to mention it here is because one, we have been doing so already using different channels. So thinking, for example, of the example of Kosovo, where we recently did work, we sent behaviorally informed letters and emails and SMSs to taxpayers. So we tested these different channels, all with positive results. We have also looked at different target groups. So the people who behavior we want to change. So we had interventions directly with taxpayers paying personal income tax, but also with firms focusing on value-added tax. And I think this firm component is interesting also when we think of public procurement department for obvious reasons. So I'll now go through an example of 2 of these trials, just to make concrete how this works. So looking at the example of letter reminders that were sent to promote payment around personal income tax, what was the situation here? There was no standardized reminder letter in place at the time we started the intervention. And what we did is in the trial, we focused on getting taxpayers that had not submitted their annual declaration by the due date to do so by using 2 types of messages. So one was a simple behaviorally informed reminder that you can see on the left that included principles of simplification and so forth. And the other one basically said it was similar, but included an additional message. So it indicated that previously we had considered your failure to declare an oversight. However, if you do not declare now, we'll consider it to be your active choice. And you may therefore be audited and could face the procedure established by law. So here, what we are doing is we are giving taxpayer, look, we gave you a break until now because maybe you made an honest mistake, but from now on, we'll consider this is no longer omission, it's an active choice from your part. And this letter was sent to around, these 2 letters were sent to around 8,000 taxpayers that had not submitted. Another example of a trial that we did in Kosovo was email reminders for value-added tax. So in the second trial, focusing on firms, taxpayers who within a few days of the month had not yet submitted their declaration were identified and were sent emails. So more than 10,000 emails were sent. Half of these were a simplified reminder. And then in other cases, we had these behaviorally informed reminders testing different messages. So as you can see on the screen, so not paying your taxes places an unfair burden. So an appeal to being a good citizen. The second example focuses on highlighting the public goods that can be paid with the taxes that are collected. And then the third one is an example of what we call the social norm. So communicating that the majority of people, so 7 out of 10 firms, submit the declarations on time and make the appropriate payments. So indicating that the social norm, so the common behavior, is actually payments. So now to the results. So I'm here just showing you the results for the trial that we did in terms of sending behavioral letters to increase declaration of personal income tax. But in fact, we found similar results for the email and the SMS trials that I was mentioning before. Here, what we observed was that 6 weeks after the due date, there was a statistically significant increase in the declaration rate. This was equivalent to 44% and 73% increase in the declaration rate for the people that had not declared. In the first case, of 44% increase for the deliberate choice and 73% for the simple behavioral letter. So just simplifying that letter and adding a few behavioral insights led to this massive increase in declarations. So ahead of finishing, I wanted to focus on a few takeaways from this. One is that we use this adaptive learning approach. So we had the opportunity to work with the Kosovan tax administration, which was very keen in improving their system. And we ran 3 different evaluations using different communication channels that I was mentioning before. So that really helped us to use behavioral insights to generate success in terms of increasing payments. But beyond that, it helped us to uncover a number of issues, especially with data management. So one thing that we observed was that, for example, besides these improvements, there was around 50% of the letters that were sent that were not received. So this was because of issues in terms of the administrative data that they had. And the administration considered this to be quite a big result also because it helped them identify failures in their systems that can now be improved towards making even bigger improvements in trials that follow. So these process gains that came from this behavioral intervention, I think could be as valuable as the intervention itself, which also resulted in increased gains in terms of revenue collection. So I'll leave it at that, just saying that behavioral science can really help us in tackling pertinent issues that are sometimes overlooked, but which, if addressed from a behavioral point of view, can really lead in big improvements to performance and operation. And thank you very much for your time, and I'm available to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Joanna, thank you very much. That was extremely interesting, and thank you for your examples related to public procurement. It was not easy, I know. And before we move to questions and answer sessions, I would like to give a floor for Krish to present some more examples procurement related. Please, Krish.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you, Joanna, for a very nice presentation. I'll just take a few minutes. I'm not going to take long because I would like to spend some time on Q&A when Joanna is connected. Just an example for your thought process in terms of market behaviors. I mean, if you are in the supply chain management, public procurement area, logistics, there is the other side of behaviors by the markets, like how do markets behave. Let me give you one example of how complaints are lodged by losing bidders. There is a pattern. I mean, we have observed in some cases certain patterns of complaints. What happens when a complaint is lodged? You think that the complaint is a legitimate complaint. Sometimes the complaint may not be legitimate. Let me give you a practical example. Say there are 6 companies in the market, and these are the only 6 companies they participate, maybe typically in an energy sector or a sector that has only proprietary nature of goods and services and equipment. So in one bidding or tendering, bidder A receives the award, and bidder B is presumably the second runner-up, and bidder B complains saying that the bidder A was awarded the contract not legitimately, there were some issues with his bid and so on and so forth. And then you go on assessing the complaint, and finally the complainant just says, okay, he gives up. Okay, the next time, bidder B gets the award and bidder A complains or bidder C complains. So if you analyze the complaints pattern, you find that there is a behavior pattern that they complain to camouflage the collusive behavior. So there is a collusive behavior pattern between the bidders, but they camouflage it or they hide it by putting a complaint, giving an impression that they are not colluding, but they are indeed colluding. Okay, so the pattern analysis, so that's where the data analytics plays a great role. The patterns within the data analytics will also give us some idea about behaviors. And data visualization to policymakers, which are actually simple in understanding. In maybe one slide with a chart of different data and analytics will actually give some policymakers like ministers of finance, ministers of economy, and so on, within a matter of few minutes, they will be able to ascertain what we are talking about in terms of public procurement. Because we tend to go very technical with policymakers, and many of these policymakers don't understand the technical language, too complicated for them. But if you make it easier with data analytics and visualization, you can actually make some positive behavioral changes that could in turn lead to some very powerful policy changes that are required in public procurement. I just want to make one more last point before we could open for the Q&A. We also found out there are various mechanisms for systems-based controls. I'm sure in any electronic public procurement or digitization of procurement, there are control measures where there are pop-up flags that come in. For example, if the estimated cost of a particular procurement is $100,000, and when they are awarding a contract or a purchase order, which is $200,000, there is a pop-up flag that comes up saying that, are you sure that you want to award the contract at double the price of the estimate? If so, what is the rationale? What are the reasons? And this will be submitted to your supervisor and perhaps his supervisor to approve that particular contract. So what happens there? Immediately, the person who is actually entering the data, if he or she has made a mistake, they'll correct it. If they are defrauding the system, they know that they're going to be caught. So obviously the behavior changes in those. And there are very many examples of behavioral changes by electronic control mechanisms that can be really put in place. So let me stop here. And there are very many examples that we can share, but I will open for Q&A, and I'll ask Joanna also to chip in terms of responding to some of the specific questions. Thank you.
Krish, thank you very much. These are very relevant examples and suggestions. So let's start the Q&A session. Коллеги, участники, пожалуйста, мы сейчас открываем сессию вопросов и ответов. Воспользуйтесь этой возможностью, задавайте свои вопросы. Для студентов еще раз хотим повторить то, что Акалбек Сапарбекович сказал, что мы будем работать совместно с университетом над разработкой курса по поведенческим практикам. Пожалуйста, вы можете задавать вопросы в чате, вы можете с места задавать вопросы, дайте мне знать, и мы начинаем. Да, Эльмир, пожалуйста.
Здравствуйте, спасибо вам за интересную и полезную информацию. Вот когда мы ходили на практику, закупающие организации и специалисты по закупкам говорят, что в работе имеются слабые стимулы, ну, такие как зарплата, соцпакет и слабая мотивация. Я бы хотела узнать, что вы думаете по поводу этого.
Joanna, Krish, would you like to take the question? About the motivation.
Sorry, Irina. Yeah, so just a quick comment. I can only see the Russian, the question in Russian, not in English.
Okay,
so.
you change in the interpretation, please
English.
change to English channel. The question, you need to click on interpretation symbol.
Got it. Thank you. Sorry, Irina.
So, and the question was about low motivation. When the students visit our projects, they noticed that the motivation in terms of the social package, for instance, is quite low. So what would be your advice and reaction on these questions from Elmira? And I understand Elmira is a student in the technical university.
Да, я являюсь студенткой.
Okay, good. Please.
Yeah, so I can help address that. I think, like, here, first of all, it is important to understand what sort of incentives are already at play, if they, be it social incentives or not, and then to understand if those incentives are actually like good incentives, but may not be applied. It may be an implementation issue. They are not applied the best possible way, or they are they exist, but in practice they are not being used. So thinking, for example, of the Romanian case study that I was discussing before, there were a number of solutions to managers in terms of like simple acts to reward staff, such as access to training, use of encouragement for good performing work, and so forth. But what we observed was that there was good, let's say, good managers that were effectively acting on the behavior, and others that were not. So understanding what sort of incentives already there are and if they are being applied or not would be the first stage. Then thinking also whether those incentives are aligned with, in this case, the needs of the individual whose behavior we want to promote. That is important as well. So thinking if there are other sort of non-financial incentives that can leverage either peers or individuals that have, for example, role models that we can leverage. Those could be ways to go.
Can I come in, Irina?
Okay.
I just wanted to add something.
Yes, please.
Thank you for the question. I think that's a very good question and very pertinent question. And Joanna, thanks for clarifying. Just wanted to compliment with what Joanna said, that I think it has got something to do with procurement being treated as a profession in the civil service. Many a times it is not the case. So when procurement is treated as a profession with a clear path for progression in the career, and then the progression is linked with good performance, I think these are some of the factors which also contribute to someone performing seriously with motivation and enthusiasm. Many a times when these motivations lack, or when these mechanisms are not there, people do not, or the procurement professionals do not get motivated to perform better. So that's also another aspect that I wanted to add to what Joanna said.
There is a quick thanks, Comrade Jana. I just want to add something very quickly, right? The point I made in my opening remarks that there is a general tendency for punishment and sanctions in procurement, and many decision makers in procurement, they're afraid that they're going to be punished for making a wrong decision, and so nothing happens. So the motivation is not there for them to perform faster and so on. I agree with Kwamrul and Joanna's comments in professionalization, making procurement as a professional career stream rather than seeing them as a back office staff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krish, Kamrul, and Joanna for answering the question. I would like to add that Elmira is definitely right. The motivation is not there, particularly for public procurement personnel, where the salary level is quite low, and you are aware that there is a lot of inspecting authorities chasing procurement specialists in our countries. And what I was thinking that it could be an initiative that, for instance, those procurement department who has the least number of failed bidders will be a good indicator of good performance that could be discussed. And there is another question from Arslanbek about the possibility to have a practice in the World Bank department for the students of 4th or 3rd or 4th course. We have this initiative with technical university, and the projects which are financed from the World Bank take students for practice. Yes, and the World Bank itself in the Kyrgyz Republic, we do not conduct procurement themselves for the project. We do another role. We provide advice, supervision, support, but the real procurement happens in the projects which are financed by the World Bank. And this project takes students, and for the several years we have this initiative. And please talk to Akılbek Saparbekovich, and he will advise on the opportunities for the practice. Иван, да, пожалуйста, мы слушаем вас.
Здравствуйте, приветствую вас. Я хотел задать вопрос, как учитывать национальные и региональные особенности поведения в государственных закупках. Да.
Спасибо большое за вопрос. So, the question is about any national or regional aspects of the behavioral science, how we can take these aspects, regional aspects and national aspects into consideration.
I can try to have a first go at it. I mean, it's a really broad question. So I guess my counter question would be like, are you actually noting, because that's an important aspect when we approach an issue. So I have been referring to something that I call the target group, or are the individuals whose behavior we want to change. And it's important for us to, when we start an intervention, to understand if there's different types of individuals. So the regional distinction could be one of them. If we assume that individuals from different regions will have different behaviors in terms of what we are trying to look at. An example could be what I mentioned before in terms of social norms. So these are really informed by the context. So for instance, the specific department where the individual may be working may have very specific rules or enforcement or not of rules. May you observe the behavior of your peers, like the ones that were close to you, that can again influence the way you're performing your actions, such as in the example that I gave in terms of applying effort in the evaluation of bids. So differences in terms of social norms, the way the institution is managed at a region level, that could be a way to go in terms of trying to identify distinctions. But I think in order to more like directly address the question, I would need a little bit more information in terms of what differences in terms of regional behaviors are we talking about.
I can
Yes.
provide a concrete example that I'm currently working on. For example, we are conducting a procurement data analytics that Krish emphasized in his remarks in Croatia, for example. And the data analytics over the last few years found that there is a concentration of bidders, in the public procurement from certain districts or from certain geographical areas. But in certain geographical areas, you will find that there is no bidder over the last 4 or 5 years. There has been no winner from say 6, 7 districts or regions. They hardly participate. They don't win the contract, but there are districts or the capital city where the bidders often participate. They win the contract. So there is a clear divide that these are the most active areas, and these are the less active areas. So this is a clear indication that something must be wrong on the other side of it, and that requires, as I think Joanna also reflected, that it may require some qualitative, like focus group discussion, and also survey to understand actually where are the gaps, where are the bottlenecks that prevents them. So there is a need to do some kind of analytical work by reaching out to them or to the economic operators or the firms and the bidders in those areas to understand why they avoid participating in public bidding. So the solution will pretty much depend, or the behavioral intervention will pretty much depend on what comes out of these survey and then qualitative analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwamrul. That's really helpful. And maybe just a quick comment following on that. I think you were spot on in terms of mentioning that we need to understand a little bit more the bidding behavior by focusing on the firms and trying to understand if like the barriers for entry may differ, for instance, different depending on the regions or districts. That can also give us insights into the actual procurement process. So, for example, a potential issue could be in terms of how the procurement is being managed in the different districts. For instance, how responsible the procurement officers are to request for clarification or for aid and so forth. And there we start to enter again into aspects linked with motivation and what type of behavior or outcomes are really valid in an organization. If you think, for instance, in terms of addressing requests for information, the number of requests addressed versus the quality of the information that is provided, these are two very different outcomes, right? And if we really reinforce one versus the other, you're likely to have different outcomes. So all of these are aspects that are worth considering, but a focus on firms would also give you that initial information also in terms of how the process is working. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Камрул, Джоанна. Давайте еще один-два вопроса, коллеги, студенты, прежде чем мы завершим сессию. Пожалуйста.
Здравствуйте всем. Я являюсь студентом направления логистики, и у меня следующий вопрос. При оценке конкурсных документов часто бывают противоречия цены и качества. Хотелось бы услышать ваше мнение по данному поводу.
Kamrul, would you like to address this important and very relevant procurement question? How to address the quality and price issues in the bidding?
It's a very wide, very broad question, because quality and price, should complement each other. I mean, in a bidding process, it's quite tricky, because when the bidder, when the purchaser defines the quality that it is expected to receive out of the offers, then there is no end to good qualities. I mean, it can be better. But again, because it's a competition, so the bidder also is mindful that he has to provide the quality, but also win through the price. It has to be also the lowest price. So that balancing always is always critical, and then the bidder usually it's their strategic decision as to how best to price their bid that meets the quality as well as confirms to be the lowest price bidder. But that's ideally should be the situation. But again, I mean, you'll find, I mean, there are so many examples that bidders also try to deceive, that they offer the quality that or the kind of technically compliant bid that the employer is expecting, but offer a very low price just to win the contract, because they know that if they win the contract by offering a very low price, then they will start playing with the employer, or they will, collaborate or collude with the employer to make, amendments to the contract, variation orders, and then start, rising the contract price, and then ultimately will basically cover up, the loss or the compromise that they had during the bidding process. So these are some of the factors as an employer one should be very careful about, that you are not being deceived. So there is no low balling, so that people just putting a low price win the bid and then try to cover up. That's why you will find in many good procurement laws, or even in the bank's procurement regulations or law, you will find that we have a very specific provision as to how to avoid those kind of bids, how to conduct the tests to see whether these bids are trying to lowball and win a contract in an undue method or undue process. And I think an employer should be very cautious and careful about these kind of offers or bids from the private sectors or the private firms.
Камрул, спасибо большое. Я бы хотела добавить, что более года назад в закон о государственных закупках Кыргызской республики было внесено изменение с тем, что проводятся двухпакетные процедуры. То есть на этапе технической оценки цена скрыта. Это помогает провести качественную оценку без, скажем, какой-либо предвзятости от знания цены. Это может быть одним из примеров, как можно, скажем, сбалансировать вопросы цены и качества. Кроме этого, скажем, в процедурах Всемирного банка есть другие механизмы, такие как, скажем, бальная оценка, где за качество предложение компании зарабатывает определенные баллы. Еще раз хочу отметить, что очень хороший вопрос, очень релевантный. И да, разные организации думают над этим, и есть определенные механизмы, которые помогают, скажем, более независимо и непредвзято оценивать предложения. Еще один вопрос у нас в чате по поводу финансирования проектов. Если можно, я быстро отвечу. Всемирный банк бизнес-проектов. Всемирный банк, группа Всемирного банка состоит из нескольких организаций, и одна из организаций группы Всемирного банка, Международная финансовая корпорация, работает с бизнес-проектами. У нас есть очень успешные проекты в Кыргызстане, такие как производство продуктов питания Тойбос, банк KICB, упаковочные материалы Алтын-Аджидар, мукомольная продукция Акун, которые были проектами с участием Международной финансовой корпорации. Что касается небольших, скажем, каких-то бизнес-проектов, у нас тоже есть ряд проектов, которые работают с небольшими фирмами в сельском хозяйстве, скажем, через агентство Арис реализуются такие проекты. И есть еще проекты, которые именно с кредитованием мелкого бизнеса связаны, также проекты в селах. Поэтому, если есть какие-то специфические вопросы, можете мне на e-mail написать, я постараюсь предоставить информацию, в какие агентства необходимо обратиться. И сейчас вот последний вопрос Бегимай, наверное, прежде чем мы завершим, потому что, коллеги, мы уже свой лимит превысили по времени. Пожалуйста, да, Бегимай. Нет, да, Кылбек Сапарбекович, все, мы можем заканчивать, наверное. Коллеги, если еще какие-то вопросы у вас возникнут по вот тематике сегодняшней презентации, пожалуйста, можете, да, направить на почту. Да, Кылбек Сапарбекович, пожалуйста.
On behalf of my colleagues, teachers, and students, I would like to express our huge gratitude to Krish, to Joanna, and 12 bank team in Bishkek, led by Irina, for organizing this workshop. It was best opportunity by involved to science of behavior. Topic and content of workshop coincide with present challenges in sphere of public procurement. I hope and I believe our fruitful cooperation should be continued. Separately, particularly many thanks to our speakers. Best lecture conducted by your tireless efforts. Thank you, many thanks. I would say see you soon, all of you.
Thank you
again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Спасибо большое, Коллеги, надеюсь, что вам было интересно. Это такая инновационная действительно тема, чтобы поменять поведенческие паттерны именно от страха наказания к поощрению хороших, скажем, поведенческих навыков. Поэтому разрешите мне закончить сессию на этом. Я всех благодарю за участие. Студентов, наших коллег из отделов реализации проектов, которые как раз сегодня тоже присоединились. Хочу поблагодарить за участие тренеров учебного центра и департамент государственных закупок. Мы сейчас с вами закончим сессию, и у нас будет внутренняя встреча, поэтому все студенты и специалисты ОРП могут отключаться. Всем хорошего дня, будьте здоровы, берегите себя и удачных вам закупок. Всего хорошего всем.
До свидания.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Ирина, здрасте, мне кажется, нужен будет департамент.
Kamrul, I wanted to check with you about the university and training center. Our meeting should include only procurement department, or we also need university and the training center of the Ministry of Finance?
I think we can have all of them, because
okay.
I think there is nothing wrong getting inputs from everyone.
Okay, very good. Еще раз, да, коллеги и специалисты ОРП, я попрошу вас отключиться сейчас, и только университет Акылбек Сапарбекович остается, да, учебный центр Минфина РК, Мирбек из департамента государственных закупок и Всемирный банк. Всем спасибо, коллеги.
Okay, Irina, I think you can start.
Let me give a call to Мирбек. Мирбек, вы здесь? Я вас не вижу, к сожалению.
Правильно, я здесь.
Здесь все, вижу, да, вижу. Yes, Kamrul, we can start our internal meeting.
Okay, thank you so much, and I thank everyone for staying back. I know it's late on Washington side, but I think this is an important discussion we wanted to have after the meeting. Let us make it brief. And the reason we wanted to have this internal meeting is that I think on one hand, I would definitely acknowledge that this was a very good introductory presentation to introduce the concept of behavioral science in the mind of all those who are working with procurement at the technical university or in the ministries. I think this is a new window that's being exposed today, and I'm sure people will be thinking of it. And whenever I find or I think of behavioral science, I always, visualize two aspects. Of course, there are technical aspects, that there are certain technical interventions which can influence behavior. But I also see the therapeutic aspect of it. I think there could be certain interventions which could touch the soft side of human being to basically behave in the right approach and make an impact. So I think this has two very hard and soft side of it. Given that we know a little bit of it, and I'm also glad to know that the university will be introducing a module in their curriculum to expose their students further on this subject. So we were thinking at the same time, how about also piloting some of the behavioral interventions or solutions to address some of the critical procurement problems in Kyrgyzstan or in Kyrgyz Republic. I think this will also provide students not just the theoretical aspect, but also an application orientation to see how some interventions could address procurement challenges. So we internally in the World Bank had some discussions with Joanna, our expert on this, and there are few ideas that I would request Joanna to share. And then following Joanna's communication, I would request feedback from the university, from the Ministry of Finance, to see which of them, it should be a very small pilot and a small scale, just to initiate and demonstrate the value of this behavioral intervention, based on which we can think of later on having a bigger intervention. So over to Joanna.
Thank you so much, Kwamaru. So I'll try to be brief, because one, I can provide any clarification you would like to, and then I would especially like to hear from you to understand a little bit more your context and the problems you may face. Now, following, as Kwamaru was saying, from an internal discussion we had, we thought that perhaps three types of interventions, pilots, so small behavioral interventions, could be interesting here. The first one focuses on one of the aspects that I mentioned during my presentation, namely trying to understand the behavior of firms in terms of their application for public procurement. So the broad questions of who is selling to the government, and understanding what is determining their decision to participate or not. So trying to look, for example, at whether there are bottlenecks or barriers for participation, be it in terms of the motivation from the firms, the way the procurement process is operating, and so forth. We would mainly propose to do so through the use of a survey to firms, to really try and map this out. A mention here is that with Kwamaru, we discussed this briefly. He mentioned there was one of the things that you observed is there was very low participation from international firms. So I would be interested to learn a little bit more on that. In terms of conducting this work, we would in principle need access both to firms that are already selling to the government, but also eligible firms, so firms that could be selling and are not yet doing so. Because it's interesting for us to learn also from the ones that are not yet doing, because those may be the ones that are facing bigger barriers or lower incentives for actual participation. So it's important to understand both from current participants and from firms that are not yet performing. So that's the first, set of issues that could be addressing from a behavioral point of view. The second one would focus more on one of the aspects that was discussed throughout, which has to do with performance and incentives. So looking at like the performance management systems, meaning the performance assessments, the incentives for staff to perform, career management, and so forth. So here we could be carrying out the behavioral diagnostic, mainly with a qualitative nature, also considering that this would be a small like pilot work to try and really uncover what are the barriers for action at these different places, and then thinking. So whenever we do a behavioral diagnostic, we try and do this journey map and map the barriers for action, and then we think on solutions. We make concrete proposals for solutions that could be implemented for later testing. So that's the second set of issues. The third set of the third issue and a problem that we could tackle from a behavioral point of view has to do with the process optimization. So as far as I understand, you have an e-procurement system in the Kyrgyz Republic. So there we could have the chance to really look at how the system is operating. Are there frequent errors or ways in which we can improve or optimize performance in some of these stages? Thinking, for example, how we may be able to reduce friction for action, facilitate how the information is perceived and processed by procurement staff to make their job easier, and so forth. So here more again at the level of process optimization of the procurement platform itself. So obviously I can provide any more details on these, but I'll leave it here. So one, looking at the behavior of firms and what barriers they may be facing to sell goods to the government. Second one, looking more at the performance management systems and incentives for procurement staff. And finally, focusing on process optimization of the e-procurement. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Joanna Kamrul, do you want to seek response and reaction from the public procurement department on these ideas, on these three topics? Yeah.
Yes.
Мирбек, да, можно, пожалуйста, вот то, что Джоанна озвучила, вот то, что мы предлагаем, первоначальный какой-то такой обзор сделать именно с фирмами, да, по поводу почему они там участвуют, не участвуют, какие-то гэпы, пробелы в электронных закупках, вот то, что Джоанна сейчас озвучила, что можете сказать, вот такая диагностика, будет ли полезно, что вы по этому поводу думаете? Пожалуйста, вам слово.
Спасибо, Ирина. В первую очередь я хочу поблагодарить госпожу Жуану за такую плодотворную презентацию. На самом деле, поведенческая наука в системе государственных закупок, она для нас она немножко новая вещь. И, в принципе, мы его предложение по 3 направлениям, которые было озвучено, это обследование фирм, это эффективность и мотивация, и оптимизация процессов. В принципе, она потихоньку у нас проводится на данный момент. Относительно веб-портала, как вы знаете, веб-портал был запущен в 2015 году, и на данный момент она является единственным инструментом в Кыргызской республике, то есть единственной площадкой, где проводятся все государственные закупки. Соответственно, все процедуры государственных закупок открыты, публичны, и любой желающий может участвовать в системе госзакупок. Относительно нежелания участвовать нерезидентов, ну, данный вопрос, она как бы стоит. Ближнее зарубежье, поставщики ближнего зарубежья и России, то есть, в принципе, на наших закупках они участвуют. И довольно-таки активно участвуют в таких крупных конкурсах. Относительно дальнего зарубежья, да, они как бы участвуют, но на данный момент как бы одно из, наверное, основных препятствий, может быть, так я сказал, является это функционирование веб-портала на английском языке. То есть веб-портал функционирует на данный момент на русском языке и процентов 30 на 40 на кыргызском, на государственном языке. И по данному направлению мы как бы ведем работу по функционированию веб-портала на английском языке. Относительно обследования фирм первого вопроса, мы года 2 тому назад проводили такой опросник, и одним из таких значимых, наверное, причин, почему не хотят поставщики подрядчик участвовать в закупках, это, наверное, вопросы финансирования, своевременного финансирования. Вторым вопросом идет, как мы уже вначале упомянули, вопросы коррупции. Это вот, когда мы проводили опросник, это две причины были основными мотивами, почему не идут в закупки. Относительно эффективности и мотивации, в принципе, мы поддерживаем от применения от карательных мер к поощрению. И, в принципе, вкратце, вот такая вот у нас информация.
Да, Мирбек, спасибо большое. Камрул, do you have any follow-up questions?
Thank you, Mirbek, for your reactions. I think that's quite useful. At least we got to know what happened on those issues in the past. It's good to know that there was already a survey with the firms to know, and some issues were already identified, and good to see that on the language aspect work is being done. But on the performance management system, I'm not sure what's happening because I think there's not much information provided. But on the e-procurement system, I understand this is the open platform, so anyone can do that. But I'm not sure if that e-procurement system is only in Russian language or that's also in English language, the system.
Yeah, Kamrul, English language functionality is not completed, while the platform itself is designed to be on 3 languages: English, Russian, and Kyrgyz language.
Okay.
Yeah, the full platform is implemented only in Russian, and as Mirbek said, about 40% of the platform is also in Kyrgyz language. That is official language of the Kyrgyz Republic, but the English language functionality is not completed, and this is a missing piece. In addition, there is additional obstacles like electronic signature, and there is a new requirement to be registered as taxpayer that also could put the barriers for the international participations. And there is a process of integration within Eurasian Economic Union from those countries, that is Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, and the Armenia. The participation is easier, but outside this Eurasian Economic Union, there could be additional barriers.
Ирина, я вас немножко дополню. Относительно налоговой регистрации на территории Кыргызской Республики, она применяется для резидентов нашей страны по всей фактуре. А относительно электронно-цифровой подписи, да, мы в этом году его внедрили, и она взаимопризнаваема только 5 странами, то есть в рамках ЕС, то, что вы уже сказали. А для нерезидентов, которые не являются поставщиками, подрядчиками стран ЕС, они должны приобретать данные электронные подписи в одном из 5 стран.
Да, спасибо большое, Мирбек, понятно. То есть, как бы, ну, я понимаю, что это выбор страны двигаться в направлении электронной цифровой подписи, но, конечно, для, скажем, расширения участия это вот дополнительное такое, как бы, условие входа, да, на площадку электронных закупок. Хорошо, еще какие мнения есть по поводу предложенных вот 3 направлений? Калбек Сапарбекович, у вас есть какие-то комментарии вот к тому, что было предложено, скажем, в 3 направлениях, возможно, провести какой-то пилот? Это проработать, да, скажем, с фирмами проблемы участия, скажем, какие-то трудности работы с порталом государственных закупок и, скажем, проработать механизмы мотивации и эффективности именно в государственных закупках, чтобы увеличить эту эффективность. Мне кажется, прям очень хорошая тема, потому что сейчас прям, ну вот и последние несколько лет госзакупки прям у нас на слуху всегда, да, а обычно в негативном плане, к сожалению. Вот, в плане там каких-то нарушений у нас, скажем, проверяющие органы получают бонусы. Кстати, у них прямо хорошая мотивация, да, находить нарушения, потому что они бонусы получают за то, что нашли какие-то нарушения. Они прям применяют эту методику. Да. К сожалению, это негативно сказывается на государственных закупках. Вот. Но я думаю, что это прям очень здорово. Особенно я бы хотела предложить вот как механизм, может быть, Камрул, Джоанна, пока я вот слушала презентацию, такое предложение. Очень часто тендеры отменяются, да, по разным причинам, да, это, скажем, ошибки при проведении, потом иногда, к сожалению, это может быть какие-то коррупционные механизмы, типа победил не тот, кто должен был победить, все отменили. И я думала, что если сделать по результатам года, скажем, какой-то мотивационный такой сертификат, организация, у которой меньше всего отмененных тендеров, потому что каждый тендер – это огромная работа и тендерной комиссии, и технических специалистов. И это вот как идея, которая у меня возникла, я прям вот на стол ее сейчас ложу, так как мы обсуждаем вот в свободном формате. Мне кажется, это прям был бы один из хороших таких показателей именно поведенческой мотивации для, скажем, вот наших организаций в Кыргызстане. Передаю слово.
Елена, я немножко вам дополню. Вот то, что вы очень хорошо отметили, что как бы насчет мотивации. На самом деле, вы как-то знаете, у нас есть процедура обжалования решений. Для этого была создана независимая комиссия по рассмотрению жалоб. И по данному направлению тоже как можно применить определенные механизмы, методы для поощрения. То есть если в относительно одной или той закупающей организации жалоб в течение года или в течение определенного времени как бы не поступило или меньше поступило бы, то бы в этом направлении тоже бы применить какие-то поощрительные шаги.
Согласна, Мирбек, очень хорошее предложение. Камрул, что скажете на эти предложения?
No, I think that's a good proposal. That's a good proposal because that's seems to be simple, but I think it's a deceivingly simple area because it involved so many dimensions and so many factors that I think it would be an interesting area to look into. Because performance management often is not a very well thought of area in many of the countries, and especially for procurement performance management. And this procurement performance management varies from entity to entity in the same country, but the management could be varying from entity to entity. So the performance also varies from entity to entity. So what works best? What has worked well in one entity, and why the same task by other entity is not being performed well? I think these are some of the things it will be worth looking into and see what could be the way forward, or what type of behavioral solutions could be put in place that would motivate people to perform better and more efficiently. What is the, what are the barriers? Like, is there any obstacle, or is there any fear of applying discretionary judgments? Is there lack of a career path? Is the those is, I mean I can go on, but I think it would merit looking into it, because I know that Mr. Dwishev has talked about many things, but this one was not talked about with details, possibly for the reason that maybe there are opportunities, or there could be a lot of things to be done on this which has not been done. So if that's something that he thinks we can help with, I think I would be very happy to do that. Joanna, what do you think?
Thank you. No, I fully agree. Maybe just a couple of comments, Irina, on what you mentioned in terms of quite often bids being cancelled and like providing this certificate. It's almost like gamification at interdepartment level. It's a really interesting idea. I think it's quite an interesting problem. Typically, we would approach it by trying to first understand why, so many are cancelled. Like, could be, as you mentioned, corruption. There could be other issues as well as, for instance, processes not being clear, and there being issues in terms of submitting all the paperwork due to issues in a number of things could be happening, to then try to think what is the best kind of solutions we could be putting forward. But the one you suggested, I think it's really interesting. So that's that would be an issue in itself. I think here we are talking more on the procurement and performance management. I think that is a very interesting area of work. Furthermore, from what you have been mentioning now, such as there being incentives to even denounce colleagues for actions that are somehow having a negative effect more generally. I have a question, especially Kwamrul, you were mentioning that even the performance management system varies from entity to entity. So if I could understand a little bit more on how the procurement works in the Kyrgyz Republic. So there is the procurement department. So would we be focusing in terms of looking at performance management system they're in, or are there different entities that should be covered? Thank you.
Joanna, so the procurement system is decentralized. So basically there is a procurement department in the Ministry of Finance that is responsible for policy making. They also handles innovations, including a procurement portal. They do some supervision. They support e-procurement catalog. So they also provide secretarial function to the Independent Complaint Review Commission. And they, of course, collect all the information about the procurement, and they measure procurement using some indicators. But the real procurement happens in the procuring entities. And as Nurida, the head of the department, announced in the very beginning, there is about 4,000 of the procuring entities, including state-owned enterprises, municipal enterprises, and various governmental bodies. So the real procurement happens there.
Yeah, I mean, just to complement, I think it's a question of the application. I mean, yes, it's always good to start with the policies and the regulations put in place, but then you'll find the reason I'm saying is why different entities outcome varies, because in different ways, and that to a large extent depends on the performance management system within that entity. And you'll find that, you know, there is so much diversities brought into those policies and regulations. The practices are being so much diverse in different entities, and that might have implications, or that might have impact on the outcomes as well. Now, I think to begin with the policies, regulations, and then taking a sample of procuring entities to see how they are being applied, I think that could be a good approach. Besides taking some of the